And so the way you can take questions as you go along or hold them till the last 15 minutes. We tend to prefer the former. But yeah, so the mic is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I was disappointed that my visit to UWA got cut short, so I'm really glad Tushar was able to organize this seminar. So thank you all for virtually attending. I'm happy to take questions throughout the talk, so if you have any, just I guess, I think I'll see it if you raise your hand on Zoom, but if not, you can just interrupt. So this is joint work with Joaquim Vidier Martin at Erasmus University Rotterdam. And as Tushar mentioned, I'm looking at the relationship between the effect of conditional cash transfer programs and labor market conditions. Now I'm going to start with perhaps a broad and perhaps obvious point or statement that government policies and labor market conditions interact in many ways. And one obvious way we can, one clear example of this is that we often see government policies responding to changes in the labor market. So for example, in the United States, during the Great Recession, we had many states expand their unemployment benefit periods, for example. Right now with COVID-19, we're seeing across the globe, lots of countries thinking about or implementing or already handing out these stimulus payments in response to big changes in unemployment. But what I'm interested in this paper is a slightly different issue, and I think a more nuanced issue, and that's the following. I'm interested in whether labor market conditions might also influence how effective a government policy can be. And if you're having trouble trying to think about why this might be the case, I would say that, imagine this for education-related policies. I think this issue is particularly relevant for those. And the specific education policy that I'm going to be looking at is a conditional cash transfer program. And I'm a development economist, so CCT programs pop up a lot in my research, but for those of you who are less familiar, these programs are an extremely popular anti-poverty policy tool, and they essentially involve giving cash transfers to households that meet certain conditions. So they're usually education or health-related conditions, and the general idea is that these are intended to incentivize good behavior. So you pay people to send their kids to school, or you pay people to go get preventative health checkups. And this is a slightly dated figure. This is in 2014, but already in 2014, we can see that these CCTs were being used very widely across the globe. The red countries, Mexico and Brazil basically only, are the two countries that had programs in the 1990s. The orange countries, I believe, had programs by 2010, and then the yellow ones more recently than that. And so one interesting thing about these CCTs is that part of the reason for their popularity is due to the fact that we had early rigorous evaluations of these programs, thanks in large part to the PROGRESA program in Mexico, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. But before I go into the details about the program, I'm gonna right now just state my research question so that we're all on the same page. My broad research question is essentially just, how do labor market conditions impact the effectiveness of CCT programs? And to answer this, this presentation is going to be structured in two parts. The first part is theoretical. I'm going to outline a really simple model that shows that labor market conditions, at least the ones that relate to the opportunity costs and the marginal benefits of schooling, they clearly matter for the effectiveness of CCT programs, but in various complex ways that may not be initially obvious. And then the second part of this presentation is going to focus on a specific empirical case. And so this narrows my, this will result in kind of a narrower research question, which is, how was the effectiveness of Mexico's PROGRESA program impacted by the availability of export manufacturing jobs. So I'm focusing on a specific CCT, PROGRESA, and I'm focusing on a specific type of labor market change. So now going into the details about Mexico's PROGRESA program, this was one of the first CCT programs. It was started in 1997 in poor rural communities in Mexico. And the education component is what I'm going to be focusing on today. These were the cash transfers that were given to mothers of children in grades 3 to 9 initially, who attended at least 80% of school days. These cash transfers varied by, the size of them varied by age and gender. With girls got larger, there were larger transfers given for female children and larger transfers given for older children. This was, the older children part was in kind of to try to reflect the fact that opportunity costs rise with age. Now, as I mentioned initially, this program was rolled out experimentally, and this allowed for the rigorous evaluation of program effects. So an evaluation sample of about 500 localities was selected, and then 320 randomly from there were randomly selected to start receiving the benefits of the program in spring of 1998. And then the remaining localities started receiving the benefits about 2 years later in the fall of 2000. And by now, over 100 studies have estimated PROGRESA's impact on a lot of things: education, time use, health, nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. Thankfully, there's now a really great review paper by Parker and Todd in JEL that nicely summarizes all of this. But for the purposes of our paper, the main relevant finding is the fact that PROGRESA significantly increased enrollment and attendance in the short run and eventual educational attainment. So just a quick note about this short run versus long run. When I talk about short run effects, I'm talking about effects estimated by comparing the treatment and control groups, their attendance and enrollment during the time when the control group hadn't received the program yet. And then when I talk about longer run effects like eventual educational attainment, I'm talking about estimates on data from 5 years after the program. By this time, both treatment and control were already receiving the benefits. However, the treatment group had been enjoying the benefits for 2 years longer than the control. So that's what I'm referring to when I say long run effects. And we're gonna look at both of these. Just as a side note, this program has since been expanded and renamed twice. But more recently, it was abolished and replaced with other social safety net type programs. Now, despite the fact that there's an enormous literature on this program, what's rarely discussed is the fact that there is substantial heterogeneity in PROGRESA's effectiveness across states. So what I'm showing here are estimates of PROGRESA's long-run treatment effects. So this is just comparing treatment and control in 2003, looking at educational attainment across those two groups. And if you're looking at the full sample, the effect is about 0.2 years of schooling. PROGRESA increased educational attainment by about 0.2 years. But what I'm plotting in the remainder of the graph are these estimates separately for every state. So there were 7 states in this initial evaluation sample. And you can see quite substantial heterogeneity across states. So Guerrero, for example, has this huge effect. Veracruz also quite large. But there are a number of states that really just kind of hover very close to this 0 line, which is interesting because this is a program that's been viewed as extremely effective, and it was, but it was really only effective in 3, if you're going by 10% significance level, let's say, it was really only effective in, say, 3 out of the 7 states in which it was first rolled out. And so I think this is an important point, and it's an important issue to think about when we're thinking about future expansions, not necessarily in Mexico, but maybe in other parts of the world. But that's not to say, you know, heterogeneity hasn't been considered at all. So specifically for PROGRESA, there are a number of papers that look at heterogeneity in this PROGRESA effectiveness across lots of other dimensions. So one paper finds that there are larger effects on consumptions for poorer households. You find smaller effects on health seeking for households that participate in another program, heterogeneous effects by gender, et cetera. And so there are lots of, you know, studies that have looked at heterogeneity in general. And so this is just for the PROGRESA program, but there are also papers looking at heterogeneity in other programs. So in Nicaragua, you can, again, there's an interest in looking at heterogeneity by poverty levels. In the Philippines, there's a CCT program called the 4Ps program there, where the initial kind of impact evaluation report documents substantial heterogeneity across provinces, but they don't really give any specific explanation. And then you have even at this point, you have enough data for meta-analyses, and there are, you know, heterogeneous effects documented across things like child height, gender, and again, poverty. So there are a number of, you know, heterogeneity has been examined across a number of dimensions. The dimension I'm going to be studying here are labor market conditions. And so why is, you know, we've looked at heterogeneity in other dimensions. These might be the more relevant ones. Why am I interested in labor market conditions? Well, one, I think, good figure to show you to sort of motivate why why we think labor market conditions might matter is the following, this figure right here. Again, I'm plotting the PROGRESA treatment effect by state. And all I've done here is basically order it by state level manufacturing share on the x-axis. And you can see a really tight correlation of -0.9 between the size of the PROGRESA effect and the state level manufacturing share. And so you see really large effects. The large PROGRESA effects are concentrated among states with low manufacturing shares. The small effects are among states with higher manufacturing shares. But granted, this is, you know, 7 data points. I can't do much with 7 data points. Manufacturing shares are probably correlated with lots of other things. Although, you know, if at a first pass, if you look at other things that you think might be what's driving this instead of manufacturing shares, this does seem to be the one with the strongest relationship. So you might look at urban shares. There is a relationship, somewhat weaker, a little bit noisier. You can look at agricultural shares. Again, similar story. There is a relationship, somewhat weaker. But one thing for which there's a strong relationship as well, slightly weaker than the manufacturing share one, but definitely pretty tight as well, is educational attainment. So here you're seeing state level educational attainment, and we see larger PROGRESA treatment effects among places with lower educational attainment on average. And this makes a lot of sense. Maybe it's the case that it's harder to move educational decisions in areas where kids are already getting a high level of education, states down here. And so this could matter, and this might be what's driving that manufacturing relationship. So we're going to pay close attention to years of schooling. But again, the problem with the state level stuff is I can run a regression, I can throw in all these things, but I essentially just have seven states, and so you just lose power, and it's hard, you can't detect which one is more important. And so this is kind of where we kind of have to dig a little bit deeper to figure out what's going on here. So hopefully I've motivated kind of why I think labor market conditions might matter. Now, where do we fit in the literature? There are lots of other really good studies that look at the relationship between schooling levels and the returns to schooling and opportunity costs. And I really like all of the papers that I'm listing up here. There's this great, the Jensen paper finds that experimentally manipulating the perceived returns to schooling results in higher schooling levels. This Atkin paper, which is one that we're actually going to be referencing a lot in this project. He shows that the growth of export manufacturing in Mexico increased opportunity cost and therefore decreased schooling levels. And this last paper is, it basically tells a similar story, but in the context of India's workfare program. But I think the key difference between this paper and what they've done is that we are interested in schooling responses to PROGRESA. Remember, this is, what motivated this was an interest in, how labor market conditions might affect the effectiveness of government programs. So we're not just interested in schooling levels, we're really interested in these responses. So how does schooling respond to PROGRESA? Okay, and so I've mentioned that the specific focus, the specific labor market focus of this paper is going to be on these trade-driven changes in labor market conditions. Now, specifically, changes in manufacturing jobs driven by export-oriented industries. Now, we argue that this is an interesting question in its own right. I mean, there's a huge literature on the effects of trade on labor markets, and so clearly there's interest in this topic in general. Mexico provides an interesting case because the country took drastic action towards trade liberalization in the last 2 decades of the last century. Along with this trade liberalization came an increase in the number of new factories to produce goods for export, many of which were maquiladoras, which have special sort of tax benefits, or tariff benefits. But the other reason we want to look at these, trade-driven changes in labor market conditions is because these export jobs are arguably driven by things that are external to the location. So external demand shocks are an important driver of export jobs. I'm not saying it's the only driver. I'm not saying they're totally random, but I'm saying that there are, external demand is an important factor rather than just local demand and local labor supply, which is the problem that you would run into just trying to look at other sorts of labor market conditions. So this helps with identification. Another thing is that there were relatively large changes in a pretty short time period, and that also helps with identification here. And so then now taking a step back, what are we doing with these export jobs or these trade-driven changes in labor market conditions? We think they change the opportunity costs. That's actually been well established. They also change the returns to schooling. And so we're interested in understanding how does this affect PROGRESA's impact. So as I mentioned, we're going to start off with a basic model. We started off actually I'll tell you about the model and get back to this point. So in this model, parents are choosing a level of schooling, 0, 1, or 2, so it's a discrete model, for their children to maximize the total discounted net benefits from schooling. So this was the point that I wanted to make. We recently switched from sort of a continuous framework to this discrete framework, I think because it does a better job of capturing what I'm going to call these extensive margin versus intensive margin effects. But you can get similar conclusions just using a simple wage as a function of schooling approach. With this approach, parents are choosing a level of schooling. Basically, in the model, that level of schooling turns on this dummy and determines sort of what wages and costs you see. So WJ is the discounted adult wages of a child with schooling level J. CJ represents the total opportunity costs for schooling level J. That includes tuition fees and foregone wages. So these are totals. And then epsilon IJ is just an individual specific and level specific error term. So it's a simple setup, so we can easily write out how parents are making their decision. By the way, I'm being agnostic about who's really making this decision. It's a parent, it's a child, it's a joint decision. A decision is being made somehow. So this, the decision maker chooses 0 years of education if the net benefits from 0 years of education exceed the net benefits from 1 year of education, and as well as exceed the net benefits from 2 years of education. And you can write this out for all of the other levels. So if you choose 1, that means your benefits of 1 exceed the net benefits of 0 and 2, and then finally the same thing for 2. But I am going to make one simplifying assumption, and this is just makes it a lot easier for me to draw the pictures that you're going to see later, but I think this is a reasonable assumption, and it's that if a person prefers S2 to S1, then they also prefer S2 to S0. So that simplifying assumption allows me to basically remove this last condition here. And again, it makes the graphs that the figures that I'm going to show you a little bit simpler. So now on this next slide, all I've done is rearrange things and written everything in terms of an error term on the left-hand side and a cutoff of constants, which represent a cutoff on the right-hand side. And you'll note that these cutoffs are made up of marginal costs and marginal benefits, right? So C1 minus C0, total costs from the year of schooling 1 minus total cost from getting 0 years of schooling. That's the marginal cost of that first year of schooling. Marginal benefits here, total wages minus total wages with 0. And then down here we have the marginal cost of the second year of school and the marginal benefit of the second year of school. I'm going to combine these two statements up here, just subtract one from the other, so that now we have this statement that's made in terms of marginal costs again. So now everything is written in terms of marginal costs, and we basically have two composite error terms to think about. This epsilon 1 minus epsilon 0 and epsilon 2 minus epsilon 1. Okay, so if you look at this, what's going to determine how much schooling someone is going to get? Well, their error terms and these marginal costs and marginal benefits. Now remember, these marginal costs and marginal benefits are determined in large part by labor market conditions, right? So what wage earning opportunities are available for children of school age, that's going to go into the marginal cost function. What are the returns to schooling like in your area based on what kind of jobs are available in your area? That's going to determine the marginal benefits. So that's where these labor market conditions come in. So just to state what I've already stated, the optimal level of schooling depends on those two error terms, the two differences between the error terms, and these cutoffs, right? And these cutoffs are the marginal cost minus the marginal benefit of each year of schooling. And these things are defined by labor market conditions. They're defined by work opportunities, they're defined by wage schooling relationships specific to the labor market that you are in. And so the nice thing about this model is that you can draw a simple rectangle to show which individuals are going to choose which level of schooling. So you have on the y-axis, this is the first type of error term, epsilon 2 minus epsilon 1. On the x-axis, you have epsilon 1 minus epsilon 0. And then these two vertical and horizontal lines, this is are your two cutoff points. So this is your marginal cost of 2 minus the marginal benefit of 2, marginal cost of 1 minus the marginal benefit of 1. And based on where your error terms lie relative to those cutoff points, you can figure out who's going to get 0 years of school, it's that red rectangle here, who's going to get 1 year of school, and then who's going to get 2 years of schooling. I've also put the distribution of error terms on the x-axis. I've chosen to just draw it as a normal distribution. That's not going to be important for the points that I'm making, but it's helpful to have this distribution here for the things I'm going to illustrate later. And so obviously we're interested in how CCTs affect the schooling decision. So what does a CCT really do? Well, it shifts down or to the left these marginal cost minus marginal benefit lines, right? So you started off with this MC2 minus MB2, you shift it down. You started off with this vertical line, solid line, you shifted it to the left. And so now this changes who gets what years of schooling. And the people who change are going to be basically the people with the error terms in these shaded parts right here. These are the people who change their levels of schooling. I jumped the gun a little bit there though, because I wanted to first say that when I say, marginal cost minus marginal benefit increases the average levels of schooling, there are two channels for this. So there's the extensive margin increases. So that's what I just talked about right now, how there is a share of individuals who choose to increase their optimal schooling levels. I'm going to refer to that as the extensive margin. And then what I'm going to talk about as the intensive margin effect is the following. Of those people that actually do change their schooling levels, some increase it by more than others, right? So some will increase from 0 to 2, while others will increase by only 1 year of schooling. So that's what I'm going to call the intensive margin effect. And what I was describing to you about these shaded areas has to do with the extensive margin effect. So these shaded error terms here, those are the people that are just changing their levels of schooling to something else. Is that a hand raise?
Yes. Can I ask a quick one?
Yeah.
Sure. So can you unambiguously say that this line will come down because the general equilibrium impacts will actually decrease marginal benefits as well, right? I mean, if the wages...
Do you think immediately?
But I mean, if I'm making my decision, I'm looking forward, right? I'm using expected marginal benefit or expected wages and not the current wages. And if I perceive that, you know, everyone's getting educated now, so it'll be more difficult to find a job in the sector that I was going to enter, then perhaps some students might choose to change their decisions to downgrade their skills. Right?
I see. So yes, I'm assuming that away. I think, yeah, that would require some sort of complex understanding of what your returns are going to be in the future based on the number of years of schooling, the number of people who are getting a certain level of education. So I am assuming that away. I'm not sure how much of an issue that is, but I haven't thought about this. So yeah, but so for this, I'm assuming that yes, when you reduce, so when you subsidize, basically when you pay people to go to school, that reduces this net marginal cost. It might be dampened, I guess, by the channel that you are describing, but presumably on net, we know at least empirically that on net it does change it, does decrease it. But you're right, that's something I hadn't thought about. I'll have to think about it more. Any other questions? Okay, so.
A quick question, Teresa.
Oh yeah.
So just wanted to understand, I'm pretty sure that you must have checked for this, but the assumption that you're making that, you know, if students or their parents prefer 2 years of schooling as opposed to 1, then they also prefer 2 years of schooling as opposed to none, right?
Yeah.
Now, in this case, what happens? I'm just trying to understand how this affects your rectangle here, because if, say, for example, I'm making a decision about whether or not I want to enter into schooling, and that's the extensive margin, then I'd either make a decision on whether I want to get into schooling, or you know, if I do, then I take the 2 years, or if I don't, then it's basically 0. So is it possible that things change if you do not drop that constraint?
Yeah, so things, yes, yeah, so things certainly change, but it basically, yeah, so it just makes this diagram harder to draw. You have kind of like a line going, it's like a diagonal there, but what you can do that I think, and one thing you can do that ends up with a very similar result as what I'm showing you now is to write this as sort of like a dynamic model. So where in the first period, you choose whether or not to get that first year of school based on your expected benefits in the future, which could result from either 1 or 2 years, depending on the shock you receive there. And then in the second period, you choose whether to get that second year of schooling or stop at the first. And if you set up the model like that, and then you actually come up with similar figures to what I'm showing here. It's just that these cutoff points are not simply MC minus MB. It's MC minus MB with some additional weights. So yeah, so that's actually something that I was thinking of pursuing a little bit more to try to, to have to avoid making that assumption. So.
Does it substantially affect your extensive margin?
What do you mean by affect the extensive margin?
In the sense, the total effect that you are trying to elicit out of this exercise, if in fact, including that constraint, you see that the majority of the effect of decisions that are made for schooling are coming out of extensive margin, because parents or students essentially decide either to go all the way or not at all.
I see. So I'm not too concerned about the size of the effect in levels. I'm concerned about the size of the effect comparing two different labor market conditions. And so you're right that the first order effect would be different, but the conclusions, I think, about comparing different labor market conditions will change. But yeah, so I haven't like fully written it out all yet, so I will update you.
No worries. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so where was I? So again, so I showed you this figure here is showing you what happens with a CCT. Now, but I'm really interested in what happens with a CCT under different labor market conditions. And the obvious way that labor market conditions matter are through these marginal costs and benefits. So what if you have an area with lower MC minus MB? So either the returns to schooling across the board are a lot higher there, or the marginal costs of schooling are a lot lower there across the board. So these are levels. That's going to change the extensive margin CCT impact, but whether it's bigger or smaller is going to depend on the distribution of the error terms. So in this first example, I'm showing you two figures, one where you have a high cutoffs, and then high starting cutoffs, and then a second figure with lower starting cutoffs. And what we have here, I'm showing you the shaded areas of the people that are affected. In both figures, I'm moving the lines by the same amount. As a side note, I'm moving the first line by a smaller amount than the second line, just to reflect the fact that the PROGRESA transfer gets bigger with age, but that's not important here. But I'm shifting each line by the same amount in both figures, and you can see that the people who are affected, there's a larger share of people affected in this graph compared to this graph, but that totally is dependent on the way that I've drawn this distribution of error terms, and it's dependent on where you were relative to that. And so as a counterexample, this figure here shows two different figures where you have a higher cutoff here and a lower cutoff on the right side. And in this example, when you lower the cutoff, you actually end up with a smaller share of people affected. Right, so clearly this extensive margin impact depends a lot on what is the distribution of error terms and where does this cutoff lie relative to the error terms, right? So it's not the case that unambiguously somewhere with higher returns to schooling is gonna see larger PROGRESA effects, right? That's not necessarily going to be the case. It depends a lot on these distributions. And so again, just to reiterate that, these marginal cost and benefit levels, they can affect the extensive margin, but the direction is ambiguous. There are some cases where higher margin of benefits are going to lead to a larger PROGRESA effect, other cases where the opposite is going to be true. But the other thing I'm interested in is the intensive margin, and I'm going to think about the intensive margin in the following way. Of the share of individuals who do increase their schooling, what share are increasing by 2 years instead of 1 year? And a sort of simple way of thinking about this question is by saying, or a simple way of answering this question is by saying, well, this depends on the size of the blue rectangle relative to the red and the green rectangles here. So this blue rectangle are all of the people. I've taken out the distributions just to make this bigger. these are the people shifting from 0 to 2 years of schooling. The red rectangle are people shifting from 0 to 1 year, so they're increasing their schooling by 1 year, and then this green rectangle shifts from 1 to 2. Okay, so if the blue rectangle is large relative to the red and green rectangles, that means there's a larger intensive margin effect.
So just a quick question. You're calling them 2 years now. Weren't they levels before? Isn't
they're levels, yeah. I don't think, I'm not for the purposes of this, I think you can think about it in any way that you would like, but are you talking the difference between like completion and just years that you go, or are you talking about the difference between whether I'm calling them a grade versus high school? And
well, one thing is what you call it. I think you started off with calling them levels, and now we need 2 years. I think to be consistent. But then the related question is, in reality, how do they know those payments will be there for a long time, or do parents sort of know, oh, there's this program here now, but we have no idea if it's going to last for 4 weeks, 4 months, a year, or 10 years? How much is, because you're kind of in this model assuming perfect information, and these payments will be there for a long time. And we're talking about decisions over a horizon of not just 1 year, but this is, probably 5 years or more, or maybe even longer. So how do you think that would affect your model and your empirics, depending on what people know about the time horizon of this and how much they can trust?
So here I am assuming that, people assume that these will keep coming. But I think in the dynamic model that I mentioned earlier, where you choose your year, go or not in the first year, then choose to continue in the second year, that model I think could easily incorporate what you're talking about. And so, and that, as I said, kind of like my first pass at that seemed to show similar general results. So yeah, I think that just means I'll probably have to shift to a dynamic model like that at some point. Thanks.
Okay.
And so here, I'm just showing sort of in graphically what we are talking about when we're talking about this intensive margin effect. And so let's now again do a comparison. And actually, before I show you the comparison, I'm just going to tell you that the relative sizes of those triangles depend on the level of the first cutoff, MC minus MV1, relative to the second cutoff. So it's not about just the, it depends on where MC1 is relative to MC2. Okay, and so we're getting here at the second derivatives. So the point that I'm making here is that it's the second derivatives that matter for this intensive margin effect. And this is what comes out clearly if you're just doing sort of a continuous schooling function. These second derivatives will pop up when you're trying to solve for the effect of PROGRESA and how it changes. And so this left-hand figure is showing you a larger cutoff number 2, that's what I'm going to call this MC2 minus MV2, relative to cutoff number 1. So I'm fixing cutoff number 1 and I'm just shifting down cutoff number 2 to go from the left figure to the right figure. And what you'll notice is that when you shift this down, it squashes down the red rectangle essentially, so leading you with a larger share of individuals shifting from 0 to 2. So for this intensive margin effect, what matters is the relative position of the second cutoff to the first cutoff. And so here you have, when you basically have a larger second derivative of cost or a smaller second derivative of the benefits, this leads to a smaller intensive margin effect. And here, when you have a smaller second derivative of cost and a larger second derivative benefit, or a larger second derivative of the benefits, this leads you to larger intensive margin effects. So what are the takeaways? Well, labor markets matter. If you believe that labor markets influence these marginal costs and marginal benefits, then it's obvious that they matter, but it's not necessarily in straightforward ways. So these levels of opportunity costs and the levels of schooling returns, they affect the CCT impact through the extensive margin. but the direction of this relationship depends on the distribution of individual areas.
Teresa, there's a question.
Yeah, sure.
David?
I have a question, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
The previous, yeah. So in this, can you tell me why the height of the the blue and the green rectangles is the same?
It should be the same, sorry, yeah, yes.
Should it be the same?
Yeah, and that's because I'm shifting the entire cutoff down, basically.
What I'm trying to ask you is that in any of the figures that you've taken, the rectangles, the red, blue and green ones, the height of the blue and the green rectangles is the same.
They should be, yes.
And why is that, is my question.
I guess why, so, and the reason they're the same is because they start out at the same level and I'm shifting the entire cutoff down. And the cutoff is just a vertical line, and so it shifts everyone down. It shifts down by the same amount across the entire error term distribution.
Okay, so let me rephrase. Can you go back to the previous slide? In this slide, why is it that the blue and the green triangles are rectangles have the same height?
Well, the height of the rectangle is determined by the size of the shift. And the shift, so this is the original cutoff, which is just a vertical line. And you're shifting the cutoff, you're assuming that, PROGRESA is a subsidy of X pesos, and that will shift the marginal cost curve down, or marginal cost line down for everyone in the same way.
So then in that case, the height of the red rectangle will also be the same.
The height of the red rectangle will also be the same as what?
As the blue and the green
rectangle is determined by so the height of the rectangle, so the width of the red rectangle is determined by what I was just talking about. But for the purposes of this figure, I've shifted this one by a lower amount than I've shifted the top line, because in actuality, PROGRESA gives larger subsidies or larger transfers for older children. So that's I just did that to reflect that fact. So this width is not the same as this height in this case.
So what you're assuming is that the CCTs are going to be lower for 0 to 1, right?
Yeah.
But they'll be higher from 1 to 2.
Yeah, and that's, to be honest, it's not very important for the points I'm trying to make here. I just did that to reflect to be closer to reality, basically.
But then are they going to be the same from 0 to 2 and 1 to 2 as well? That's my question.
Oh, so this is not, so I think, okay, so I think there's a misunderstanding. This is not the shift in this blue rectangle is the set of people who change their years from 0 to 2. Okay. The height of the rectangle is the size of the subsidy. Okay. So the size of the subsidy is the same, but the rectangles are just enclosing the set of people who change from their 1 to 2 years, and this is the set of people who change from 0 to 1 years.
Okay, thank you.
Confusion. The change in the rectangle is the subsidy, and then the people inside are the people shifting from 0 to 2, and then these are the people shifting from 1 to 2.
Okay, thank you.
So quickly following up on that. So if you write a dynamic model, then the subsidy for 0 to 1 and 1 to 2 will be different, right? I mean, if you write a dynamic model where an individual is deciding first to change from 0 to 1 and 1 to 2, depending on what age he is, the subsidy will be different, right? So in effect, like what Devika was saying, that perhaps, the 1 to 2 subsidy and the 0 to 2 subsidy, the size of it might not be the same.
That's my question.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I think I'm so this is not, you shouldn't think of this as a 0 to 2 subsidy. You should think of this as people who change their who change their schooling level. So I think that's, but to answer your, so wait, can you repeat the last part of your question again, Tushar?
Sure. So the thickness, well, the amount by which the line shifts is the subsidy, right?
Yes.
And the subsidy depends on age. So like it, by construction, depends on what grade you're choosing to go to, right? So if you're choosing to go from 0 to 1, you're younger, most probably, compared to when you're choosing from 1 to 2, right?
Right.
So,
so now you're imagining a dynamic model where you're doing
yeah. So I think what Devika was suggesting, and I think that might be helpful, is if you had the blue line shifted less compared to the green line. I mean, yes, I know that it will be difficult to do, but the subsidy shift will be between the thickness of the red bars and the thickness of the green bars.
I think, okay, so I think if I agree that if I did this in a dynamic framework, I should do what you're talking about. In this framework, I don't think what you're thinking of as this shift is equivalent to the shift that it would have, that would take in the dynamic model. So so I can see incorporating that in a dynamic model, but here this is not, you're not really, people are just making this one-time decision. So this shift has to be constant across all individuals. But so I'll have to think about how to incorporate that in kind of a two-stage model. Thanks for these comments. And Devika, sorry for not understanding your initial question. I understand now. So here, where was I? Okay, so I was at the model takeaways now. Again, so on the second part of the second piece that I was talking about was intending to emphasize the second derivatives, and those are what matter for the intensive margin. And so essentially, if you have more convex cost functions, you're going to get a smaller CCT impact. If you have a more rapidly decreasing marginal benefits, you're going to have smaller CCT impact. And so that when you now think about, well, how are exporting jobs going to affect the CCT impact, given all these complex channels, it's really unclear ex ante what's going to happen. And so to try to think about, though, what we might expect, I'm showing you some figures here relating to those second derivatives. And it's generally harder to capture these second derivatives. We don't have good measures of them, but what I'm showing here are basically just the quadratic fits between income and years of schooling, where you have the top quartile of, so in areas where there are lots of export jobs and areas where there are fewer export jobs. And you can actually see here, I mean, this is, again, there's big endogeneity issues. This is purely descriptive, but they suggest steeper increases in the marginal benefits. So, a larger second derivative in areas with exporting jobs. So this would lead us to expect a larger CCT impact. Now with it's a lot harder. So it's already hard to think about these second derivatives, and it's even harder to think about these second derivatives related to the opportunity cost functions. But I'm trying to I'm capturing here what I think sort of gets at these. And so again, here I'm again showing separately for lots of export jobs and low export jobs. I'm showing the relationship only for youths, so kids of school age, the relationship between income and age, as well as employment and age. And we see these steeper slopes for the areas with lots of export jobs, which suggests, again, it's not at all a direct measure, but it suggests that the cost function might be more convex in areas with these exporting jobs, which would lead you to expect a smaller CCT impact, right? So this, the effect of these export jobs is going to be ex ante unclear, and so we're going to investigate this empirically. Just checking on time. Okay, so we're going to use the PROGRESA data for this. We're going to use the baseline, several follow-up surveys, and locality characteristics, which we don't actually do much with. We're essentially going to create two data sets. One is cross-sectional, and one is going to be a panel data set. But both of them are restricting to the sample of children aged 55 to 16 in 1997. Now, in the cross-sectional data set, you have the educational attainment of everyone in 2003, merged with their treatment assignment and their baseline characteristics. And again, this is what I was discussing related to the long-term versus short-term effects. Here, all we can measure is the effect of having PROGRESA for 2 more years than the other group. So that's what a treatment control comparison is going to give you. Now with the panel, here we have the school attendance in several waves of PROGRESA of individuals during waves where the control group had not yet received the program. And so here we can look at, are you attending? And you're comparing the effect of having PROGRESA currently versus not having PROGRESA at all. Here are some summary statistics, not going to spend too much time on them. I'll just mention that it has been well documented that, characteristics were not totally balanced across treatment and control. And so it's important to control for a lot of the, at least some basic demographics. I've also shown the balance test by state because I motivated this with state level differences, and I just wanted to make sure that there are no huge glaring imbalances within any of the states. And we see some imbalances, but that's kind of similar to what we see for the full sample. We are also going to be using state and subdelegation level characteristics. There are 7 states, as I've already mentioned, and 24 subdelegations in the PROGRESA evaluation sample. So these subdelegations are smaller than the state level, but larger than the municipality. And I should also mention that the treatment of PROGRESA was at the village level. So the reason we need something smaller than the state is obvious. We can't do much with 7 states. The reason we need something larger than a municipality is just a feature of the data. As it turns out, in many municipalities, you don't have enough variation across treatment and control. So you have lots of municipalities with only treatment or lots of municipalities with only control. So we need something larger than that. And from the censuses, we're going to calculate at both of these levels. Manufacturing shares, these are variables I already showed you, agricultural shares, urban shares, and average educational attainment. These are mostly to make sure that our main results are not being driven by these other things. And we're also going to take the number of working age people in each state and subdelegation in 1990. We're just using that as a denominator for the export jobs variable, which I'm going to talk about now. So these export-oriented jobs, this is our variable of interest, and we get this from the Mexican Social Security Institute, the IMSS. This gives us counts of all workers enrolled in Social Security. So these are basically formal sector workers. And the data is organized in the following way. You have an employer, gender so you have counts of these workers by employer, gender of the employee, age range, and wage range. And what we're going to do is we're going to restrict to those in economic sectors that are export-oriented, as defined by this Atkin paper. And then we're just going to collapse to the subdelegation and state level. And actually, I'm not going to show you any state level results here. So it's just going to all be at the subdelegation level by gender. So we're going to have for each subdelegation the number of export jobs for a particular gender in a particular year. And we're going to divide that by the working age population that I mentioned earlier, just to normalize things. What is the definition of export-oriented? We use Atkins' definition. So he had access to a lot more of this and a lot more granular data. So he was able to see, he had access to output and export output and things like that. So he classified firms as exporters if they belong to an industry where more than 50% of output was exported for at least half of his sample years. And he had over 10 years of data. And so, but for our purposes, we just take the list of industries that he uses and classify these as export-oriented sectors. Now, this is what the distribution of the export job shares look like in our PROGRESA sample. So we have males and females, slightly different distributions, not crazily different. And we do have substantial variation. Okay, so what are we actually going to do with this data? Our goal, remember, is to investigate how trade-induced labor market changes affect PROGRESA's impact. And so broadly speaking, we're looking to estimate heterogeneity in the PROGRESA impact across subdelegations and across subdelegations in terms of this export-oriented manufacturing jobs variable. I've already mentioned that the reason we're using subdelegations is because we need more than 7 states and we need something larger than okay. So our specification is the following of child. We have child I, gender G, village J, subdelegation S, and observed in wave W. So this is for the panel data set where we have multiple waves. We look at whether they attended school, and I think it's the past month, regressed on treatment, and treatment interacted with jobs, where jobs is the number of export-oriented jobs in your subdelegation, again, normalized by the working age population, in the year prior to survey wave. Then we control for a bunch of things. We have subdelegation fixed effects, wave fixed effects. And we can also add treatment by female and treatment by wave interactions. Because jobs varies, as I showed you in the picture, males have, there are slightly more male jobs than female jobs. We don't want to be picking up any gender differences. We don't want to be picking up gender differences in the effect of PROGRESA, so we can control for treatment by female. And in case there are just any differences across waves in the treatment effect, and jobs vary over waves, we don't want to be picking up that, so we can include these treatment by wave interactions as well. We cluster everything at the subdelegation level. Because we only have 23 subdelegations, we're also going to be showing the wild cluster bootstrap p-values in all of the tables. The specification for the cross-sectional regression is simpler. We're looking at educational attainment. Now jobs is we only have one wave for everyone, essentially, 2003. And so jobs is just the average number of export-oriented jobs over that time period, over the 97 to 2003 time period. Again, we have these controls, and then we're controlling for subdelegation basis. Everything else is the same. Yeah, Tushar?
So where's the independent effect of jobs being absorbed?
I guess it's not fully it's being captured separately through the subdelegation fixed effects and the gender controls here, although we could certainly throw it in as well. I think I've played around with both of those things, but in what you're going to see, it's just the interaction. All right, so here are the results. These are the attendance results first. We have basic controls, and then we add a number. So basic controls is just age and gender. The full set of controls includes a bunch of other household demographics. Each column basically adds something. So here we just have treatment by export jobs. Here we have, we add this treatment by female interaction that doesn't seem to matter much. And then in the last column, the third column, we add by wave interactions, and that doesn't change much either. But you can see here, you have a treatment effect of about 0.03 off of a mean of 0.83. Now this can be interpreted, because we've standardized this export jobs variable, this should be interpreted as the treatment effect for people in subdelegations with the mean level of export jobs. And the interaction here is negative and significant, showing that in areas where there are lots of export jobs, you have significantly lower, smaller treatment effects. And so this is, again, this should be interpreted as a 1 standard deviation increase in export jobs leads to a 0.01 decrease in the treatment effect, which is about half of the total effect of treatment. And then things are pretty consistent across the board. These are now the educational attainment results. So, you know, so this tells us, this first slide tells us that, you know, while treatment and control, while the control group wasn't receiving any treatments, you're seeing PROGRESA increase attendance, but it's increasing attendance less for places with lots of exporting jobs. And now we're looking here sort of 5 years down the road. Let's look at what happened when you had the treatment get the treatment 2 years earlier. And so this coefficient here, this tells you that on average, for a place with at the mean export jobs, so a place with mean export jobs, treatment increased educational attainment by about 0.17 years, but this effect was a lot smaller for places with export jobs. Again, this is fairly consistent across the board, whether you add a treatment by female interaction or add a bunch of other controls. And so what we're finding is that the PROGRESA impact is smaller in areas with many export manufacturing jobs. And that suggests that, you know, going back to the figures that I showed right after the model, where I stated that, you know, the effect is probably going to be ambiguous, the effect is going to be ambiguous. This suggests to us then that it's the opportunity cost channel that must be dominating over the returns to schooling channel, because the opportunity cost was where we saw evidence that exporting jobs might have evidence for more convexities, which would suggest exporting jobs would have a smaller treatment effect. But then, you know, these treatment was randomized, exporting jobs are not randomized. So we really have to think about what else might these export jobs be capturing. Okay, and I alluded to one of those things at the beginning, it was the years of schooling. And so.
So there's a question.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I'm not seeing these.
I'll tell you, don't worry.
Yes, Teresa, can you go back to the previous table, please?
This one?
Yeah, just interesting to say the cross-term treatment, the export jobs, the coefficients bigger than the.
Yeah, it is really large, yeah.
That means completely offset the impact on treatment?
It looks like it here. I'm wondering, yeah, I'm wondering how much of a concern, like I'm not sure how much we should extrapolate given that there's some sort of, you know, there's a definite skew to the export jobs variable. So I would be curious to see what this looked like if I maybe allowed for something more than linearity. But here, yeah, so these would suggest that places with at least one standard deviation level of export jobs, higher than the mean export jobs, basically had no PROGRESA treatment effect. I think that's, again, I'll have to check if that holds up with like nonlinear specifications, but that is consistent with the fact that there were some states that had no PROGRESA impact at all. So it's not such a crazy idea that there was no treatment effect in some areas. And I think that is true, and that does seem to be true about places with lots of export jobs as well.
The export jobs variable, what's the unit of that?
This is in standard deviations.
Okay.
It's standardized, so it's, yeah, mean 0, standard deviation 1 variable.
Yeah, just trying to get some sense comparing the two coefficients.
Yeah.
So perhaps it'll be a good idea to have like the mean of that mean of the export jobs in the entire sample.
Well,
so
no, okay, so I can do that, but I just want to clarify you should interpret usually you tell people what the mean is so that they can like multiply in their head times export jobs. But here I've already like standardized it. So you can just take this coefficient and say that's the effect of moving a standard deviation up in the export job ladder, I guess. But yeah, I obviously can tell, I don't know off the top of my head, but I can tell you what those means. I can look up what those means are and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought this was the Yeah, I think that was.
Yes, Vang, I think the negative for direction, the direction is very clear. It's just trying to come to
Yeah, I think so. In the in these slides, like I think these magnitudes make more sense. They are a little bit larger. There are a lot larger relative to that main effect. It does come down a little bit when you control more control. So maybe there's just something we're not properly accounting for here. So we'd have to think about that.
Okay, yeah. Go on, please.
So just real quick to clarify, it is jobs divided by the working age population, right?
Yes, but it's standardized. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
correct. So now thinking about what else these export jobs might be capturing, you know, one thing you might be worried about is that these export jobs might gravitate towards areas with higher or lower, we're not sure, socioeconomic status. So I look to see whether this might be the case, just kind of at the, this is, all I can do here is cross-sectional because this is, I only have one census during this time period. And so, you know, with 23 observations, you're not going to have much power, but if you look at these coefficients, again, they're all standardized. So they're pretty small relative to the means. However, if you just take the whole pattern, it looks like export jobs tend to be going towards higher educational attainment areas with higher income and higher urban shares. Very, very small coefficient, but in case that this is, you know, in case this is something that could be driving the heterogeneity instead of export jobs, we're gonna run a specification that checks for that. The other thing, so this is sort of at the area level, right? Maybe it's that export jobs tend to be located in areas with higher income, higher educational attainment on average. But it also could be the case that export jobs also change things about individual households. So maybe in areas where export jobs come in, parents are more likely to be hired in these manufacturing jobs, and that might change the way they value schooling, and that might change their schooling decisions. And so there are lots of, you know, there are ways you can imagine that these export jobs would change the lives of these individuals and therefore change their response to PROGRESA. So a few things that we can look at to test for this. We can look at the father's job type in terms of these broad categories. We can look at the mother's job type, although there are a lot of missings, which we don't really know whether they're true missings or just non-workers. We know whether the siblings are working, so that might be a potential channel. And we also have household per capita labor income, as well as sort of okay proxies about the temporary migration of household members. And so I'll show you what those variables are here. Now, what we're doing here is just we're regressing, again, these variables, so dummies for various father job categories, dummies for various mother job categories, and these older sibling variables, household labor income, and then these migration proxies. And we're regressing those things on export jobs. And you can see that there are some differences, right? So in areas where there are lots of export jobs, fathers are less likely to be self-employed. It seems like that's purely coming from an increase in employee, just because that's the only other positive coefficient, or other than missing. It's not significant, but it seems to be what the shift that's going on. Older siblings are more likely to be working in places with exporting jobs. And this is actually not what I was expecting it to go in the other direction, but I could see it go both ways. It seems like in areas with exporting jobs, you're more likely to have people who are not living at home. So maybe they've temporarily migrated. So there are things that are different about household characteristics in places with these export jobs. And you could imagine that these might be driving heterogeneity in the PROGRESA treatment effect. Maybe self-employed fathers don't care more or less about education, and therefore respond more or less to the PROGRESA treatment, right? It's not, this basically makes it important for us to try to rule out these channels as potential sources of heterogeneity. So the simple way to do that is to repeat our specifications, except adding interactions between the treatment variable and all of these other things. So here, in the first 3 columns, we're just adding interactions between those census subdelegation level variables that we were talking about. Here we add the dummies for the different father's occupation, and those dummies interacted with treatment. Mother's occupation, same thing, sibling work, labor income, and migration. And you can see that the main interaction effect that we're interested in really doesn't move very much. And that's not because those other things don't matter. So I forget now exactly what direction it goes, but with father's occupation and with sibling work, you actually do see that there are different sized effects, different size treatment effects for people with siblings who work or siblings who don't work. So there are differences across these dimensions. It's just that they weren't, those differences were not what was driving this treatment effect, because this treatment effect, or sorry, this export jobs interaction effect, because that still seems pretty consistent across all of these specifications. We can do that also with the educational attainment variable. Again, we have less variation here because it's cross-sectional. And so you'll note that, especially with the bootstrap p-values, we do lose some power, but the magnitude of these coefficients remain the same, remain almost identical. It changes a little bit, regardless of whether you are adding interactions for schooling, income, or any of these other household level variables. I will say here again, so I've normalized all of these variables, I've standardized all of these variables, so you can again still interpret this as the treatment effect for someone with average export jobs and average schooling levels. And then here, the omitted categories are the modal categories. So this is the effect of treatment for people whose fathers are, I think it was employees, because that was the modal category. But yeah, the main point is that these interactions seem to hold up across these different specifications. So I think I'm running out of time. So this is the last slide. I've called it summary. This is still preliminary work, so it feels weird to say conclusion. But what we're finding right now is that the effectiveness of PROGRESA varies widely across geographic regions. Higher numbers of export-oriented manufacturing jobs are associated with lower effectiveness of the PROGRESA program. And it doesn't appear to be driven by area level schooling levels, area level income, or urban shares. And it also doesn't appear to be driven by a host of other household level characteristics, which supports our main interpretation of this, that has to do with the changes in the opportunity cost that come along with these export jobs. That's all I have for now. Thank you so much for being here virtually, and thank you so much for your comments.
Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. So I've one question about the export jobs and how you do. So you just summarize all export jobs at the moment, kind of, no matter what industry they're just manufacturing jobs. Because I just looked at the exports of Mexico manufactured goods, but it's also a lot of agricultural goods. And the difference between these two, although there are many, one of which is that agriculture, I assume, is seasonal. But manufacturing work, if I work in a factory, I can work all year round, it's the same thing. But agricultural work is seasonal. So that means if I take your results, and then I would guess that they differ depending on whether the exports are in agricultural goods or in manufacturing jobs. Because in agricultural goods, not the season at the moment, I might as well send my kids to school because the opportunity cost is not the same as if it's season. But in manufacturing jobs, I'm assuming it's rather constant throughout the year where you work in a factory. So same thing if I do this in December or June. So what the general question is, can you break down the export jobs a bit more and think about what sort of implications the different industries would have?
Yeah, so I could. I think I could, but I think so. I was double checking this on the slide now. I think most of the export-oriented sectors here ended up being these manufacturing type jobs. I don't know whether it's just because that 50% restriction means it cuts out a lot of the agriculture. I'm not sure, so I would have to double check on that. But right now, it looks like most, I mean, sure, I would have to know more about these types of industries, but at first glance, it looks like most of these are sort of the permanent types of jobs that you're thinking about.
So, but then my next question would be, can you somehow find an exogenous shock in some of these industries that would allow you to get an exogenous variation? So what I'm thinking about is, obviously oil is the obvious example where if the global price of oil is going down, then this would affect local production of oil. You don't have oil here, obviously, but I wonder if you can identify in one or two of these industries an exogenous shock in global prices, and then you could test your hypothesis a bit better with an exogenous.
Yeah, no, that's, I think, for a long time, I thought that was the next step. And then I kind of thought like, oh, I don't know if I can find an exogenous shock. Maybe I should focus on like trying to approach this in another way. But I think we're soon going to get back to that approach for sure. I'm sure we'll get the question again. So thanks. Yeah, that's a good point.
Teresa, can I ask a quick question related to that? So the idea is that these people are making choices based on their expectation of what will happen in the future. So why not, well, in a rational expectation world, they should materialize, right? So why not check what they are doing finally to see if your story goes through, if it's consistent, right? So you have employment outcome for them now.
I do not. So no, basically no. There's maybe one age cohort for whom we have employment in 2003, but everyone else is too young.
No, but like you can use the later waves of the census, right? So like, for example.
Oh, the census or PROGRESA, sorry.
So if you use the census waves, and you can still extract out people who were affected by. So I don't know what the data set would be, but I'm thinking of this paper by Jerry Berman, Susan Park, and Petra Todd, where they show that there's not a lot on employment due to PROGRESA. So perhaps, you know, you can go back and look at that paper and, like, you know, what data set they are using, be able to test if these actually materialized.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I'm super pessimistic though, because I know the 2007 wave, I've tried to work with it and it's almost no one there. But I guess I could try to look at it for that one age, the one I told you, there's one age cohort for whom we might have data. I could try it for them, yeah. So your idea is to say, look at what they are currently doing and use, and then see if that is similar to these.
Yeah, the share
consistent with those conditions, Okay.
So we have time for one last question. Devika, you want to go? You're muted.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have two questions actually. One is about the exogenous shock. I was thinking, have you taken annual or monthly data?
We've taken annual and aggregated it up, but we do have monthly. Why do you ask?
Because if you've taken a shorter span of time and you have a large cross-section in your panel, I was wondering that for a 2001 9/11 shock, have you considered a structural break? Because Mexico's primary exporter would be US, and you know, I mean, globally the demands for exports.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah. So you could, because it's a shorter time span. And my second question was about the rectangles, the red, blue, and green ones.
Yeah. Should I go back to those slides?
Thank you.
All right. So,
are you? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Are you relating any of your results to this rectangle?
No. Okay. So I think I am motivated. No, I'm not relating any of my results to this. I guess I'm relating my results more to these figures. because you have a problem with the rectangles. Okay, yeah, no, that's fair. This was, so this feedback on the model is really helpful because this was more for me to try to figure out sort of what's going on here and what would matter. And so, yeah, so this was really helpful to have.
And it would also alter once you take the assumption that you've made out of the picture, the whole scenario will alter in this diagram as well.
Yeah.
All right, cool. I must interject now, and so please join me in thanking Teresa. Teresa, thank you for the amazing
Thank you,
talk.
everyone.
Well, Alison there is clapping virtually. So hopefully this paper goes far, and like hopefully the next time you're presenting it, you do it in person here. And you won't have to go without, you know, looking around
I hope
the
so,
beautiful
yeah.
city. Yeah. All right, cool. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Peace.
Teresa.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.